bad boy. Yes.
Well, you know, it's a.
I haven't said anything. Did you by any chance? You would have had it.
Yes, sir. I just feel that. Thank you.
That sounds like hijacking, really.
Or you do it right when you wake.
Might be.
Yeah, like 30 seconds.
Good afternoon. It's Thursday at IETF 103. Thursday, said my mail. It's Thursday. I'm Chris. This is KR. This is IETF 103. If you're not for the IETF 103 meeting, you're probably in the wrong place. It's the Sidrops meeting at IETF 103. If you're not here for Sidrops, then we could say it'll be fun, or you could go on to where you're supposed to be. For those presenting, there's a little X down here on the floor. Please stand on it. Speak into the mic.
Don't do this. Don't hear you.
What?
Always speak into the mic. Okay. I think we need a minutes taker and a jabber scribe before we can go forward. Volunteers? Jabber for Benno. Excellent. There's a seat right here for you if you want. Reserved for the jabber scribe. That's how you get the good seat. Notes taker?
Give it a shot.
Yes. Thank you, Tim. Are you presenting, Tim?
Yes.
Okay. I'll type while you present. How about? Okay. Paper? Oh my God. This is cider ops. This is cider ops, not cider. Boom. Okay. Back to serious things. There's a note. Oh, this is all of our. Oh, this is the note well, I think. Maybe. Yes, this is the note well. Let's just say it is. We have an agenda. Here's the slides. We're almost into our 5 minutes. We have 2 hours. We should have plenty of time for this, but we're going to try and keep people on time, on schedule as best we can. So note the time you have if you're presenting, except for George, who has 20 minutes. Let's take the, I think you. There are 2 Georges?
Yeah.
No. Yeah, that's why there's an extra space. Just think of it like there's quotes under there. Okay. All right. First up is Oliver. Unless there's anybody who has any questions. No, good. Oliver, you're up. There's a clicker. It does the pointy thing. Okay. You can hold that or stand in front of it. Let me find
Good.
Chris,
Yes, sir.
we're doing the thingy.
Huh?
We're doing
We're doing the thingy. What do you mean? Please use a mic. Observations first.
Well, this is all happening. Just so everybody knows, we're doing RPK origin validation on the IETF network, and it seems to work. That was the thing.
Great. Okay.
Good. Yeah.
Yep. Okay, so last year we did some work on testing route origin validation with different implementations, and we made some observations what I thought might be interesting for everybody of you, and if not, then just listen to it. So the first thing what we were looking at, we wanted to see what is the impact on convergence time. We also were interested in if a router is connected to one or more caches, what happens if the connections break down, if we have changes within the connections, etc., and yeah, how does this whole thing work? We tested a little bit the implementation of route origin validations in routers. And if they implement the RFC 8097, which is on IBGP, the transmission of the validation state, and also what kind of impact this has on IBGP. So the first in convergence time, so what we did not use any excessive policy. Actually, we didn't use any policies at all. We just sent around 700,000 routes into the router. We measured how long does it take. We made it with one peer, with two peers. And then we did the same with 100% ROA coverage. What this means is we had for every prefix origin a full match prefix. And we got around an average increase of between 2 to 7%. I think the lowest even was 1.8, so we rounded this up. But this is all relative, because now if you put policy processing on top of it, the time stays the same or percentage goes down. So I think Randy at one point made some statement that it's neglectable, and I think we can pretty much confirm that. Then we looked into the validation caches, which is kind of interesting. So we used a combination between the RIPE NCC and our own cache test harness where it was a little bit easier to fill in data. And we made these tests like where the router is connected to a cache and all of a sudden the connection goes down. For example, we just pulled the cable, waited a little bit, the cache crashed, the router crashed, and all these kind of things. And interestingly, we noticed that, I mean, every router acts differently. Some detect relatively fast the loss of the cache, and others seem not to. They did eventually, but this is all like configuration based. And so if the router detected it fairly fast, that increased the churn on IBGP, because only if you signaled the validation state, because now the validation state changes, the attribute changes, and you have to re-announce even as the path is selected. It's not much, but it's something to look at. So eventually what we figured out, it might be good if the router is not really that sensitive to the loss of a connection to the RPI cache, or even if you have maybe more than one cache connected to the router. Then we looked into the signaling of the validation state. We noticed that not every router implemented it 100% the way as the RFC specifies it. We talked to the vendors, we got fixes for that. So maybe just you look into your own gear, what you have, and check and talk to the vendors. There are fixes out there if you see something. Some implementations label internal routes as valid. Some allow to have the validation state configured. Some take the validation state if it is signaled via the RFC 8097. Then we looked into the AS set. The AS set is an interesting thing. So some routers had issues with the AS set actually. So when we receive via eBGP an AS set, if the prefix, we cannot determine an origin. But if the prefix is not covered, then it's not found from the algorithm. If the prefix is covered, then it should be invalid. Interestingly, we found an awful lot of not founds, which didn't switch to invalid. We received one fix from one router vendor. So, but it doesn't necessarily need to be a bug, because if the vendor decided I don't perform origin validation on routes with AS set, then the RFC says if you choose to not validate it, label it as not found. So I don't know in the internals of the routers if they just chose to not validate it, then it's fine. If they chose to, then they have a bug. Maybe you should look at your gear, how this one reacts to that. Let me skip over this right now. So then I think I talked about this already. So on IBGP, we have some routers basically, as I said, label the updates as valid if they don't see anything else via the IBGP, via the community string. Another router labeled these as unverified, what I actually liked when they didn't do anything. And there's also kind of way how you can configure it. The interesting thing, what we noticed there, actually, we didn't only notice that we actually made use of that for some of the measurements, and later on we thought, wait a moment, that's actually kind of an interesting behavior. Number one is the prefix packing. So if I receive via EBGP an update with, let's say, 3 prefixes, and the validation says 2 of them are valid and 1 of them is not found, then out of 1 update becomes 2. So later on, we noticed this because we were counting the updates that go in and come out, and something was off, and we were wondering why. And then we figured out, yeah, actually, it doesn't need to be something bad. It's just something what you should consider if you turn on this attribute. What becomes more interesting down here, I have only 1 prefix, and now my connection to the validation cache starts flickering. It's up, it's down, it's up, it's down. So if the same prefix stays selected, I receive it as valid, then I receive it again with not found, with valid, with not found. So that's why a not that fast reaction to the loss of a validation cache might be actually not that bad. I always hated this word conflicting validation results, but I had to actually educate myself a little bit, because we can actually have conflicting validation results. You can have the same prefix origin in the router that has all 3 validation states. How can that happen? I have an AS that has, well, let me go one back, that has 3 routers. Every router has their own validation cache. They're not synchronized, they're pulled at different times. And one router might say that this prefix origin is not found. This one says it's invalid, this one says it's valid. And then if they add this one as extended community string, then router 1 will have now its table prefix 1 origin 1 3 times with 3 different conflicting validation results. Just something to think about it. If maybe local processing might make more sense, even on the IBGP side, or if every of these router maybe connects to a centralized validation cache, that might fix some of the things so that at least the validation results might all be the same. Because what can happen now is if R1 receives traffic for prefix 1 origin 1 and ASA, basically, it might be AS origin 1 actually, or it might just provide me with the route to it. If the traffic comes in here, I would prefer that it goes out right away to ASA. But if I now prefer valid, this link here is not found. This one is invalid and this one is valid. So now R1 carries the traffic through its own network to the West Coast and then sends it out to ASA. Just something to think about. Same in some router implementation if R3 doesn't do any route origin validation, and router 1 then by default declares this one as valid. Just if you deploy this, just think about how you have to create your policies to maybe avoid certain things, or think about that these things can happen. I don't want to say it's good or bad. I just say that's an attribute of the beast, basically. So in general, what I figured out, number one, documentation could really be better. Throughout all the routing implementation, I have to include ours as well. More examples could be out there. Maybe there are, I just didn't find them. But if someone starts really fresh with that, they're really on lost grounds, because we even saw that in some router implementations, we saw some labeling that would imply certain settings, and I didn't find any setting that could activate something. Like I saw something with primary and secondary cache. I did not figure out how can I say I want to have primary, secondary cache. I figured out that the implementation all made a union. What is actually a nice thing? Maybe better than primary, secondary cache. Because now if I have 2 caches connected and one of them dies, I don't lose everything right away. Other thing that, so union, again, the detection of the loss to a cache. I think it's better to work with stale data than permanently have this flickering. Yeah, I think I don't need to say more to this. The other thing is, if I turn on the RFC 8097, I might see more traffic on IBGP. I lose a little bit of prefix packing. I don't know if it is a concern. I don't think it's a concern right now, but I don't know how this evolves over time. And that we can have conflicting router states. So the question here is it interesting to create a document where we start documenting these kind of experience things for people who come fresh in? I think yesterday in the Grow working group, they were talking about like a living document, what can be always updated. Maybe something like this could be an interesting thing in this regards, because things that might be an issue now might not be an issue in 6 months. Maybe things that we don't know yet are an issue might be an issue in 6 months. And something that has value for especially newcomers. I mean, we are still in the deployment stage. Many people come in, they hear this the first time, or they maybe heard it 10 years ago and still are in the mindset of 10 years ago, but they don't know what it is. And where we just can update things. So for someone who gives a quick start, something for the community there, we can exchange a little bit and have some value. Not something what is 200 pages long, or something that is maybe, I always hope for one, but maybe a handful of pages, maybe some ideas on how you can configure. Not that you have to do it like that, but just what you have to consider in something like this. So that is one thing. And we also think that we will, we don't know anything, we plan on doing some more tests. If there is something that some of you really would like to see, drop me an email, or Sriram or Doug Montgomery, whoever, and then we can see if we can put this into this test, what we want to do, or maybe that is something where we say, hey, that's really cool. We want to do that. I mean, we don't have limitless resources, but if there's some interest in testing certain things, what you think is valuable also for the community, let us know. Questions?
I got 2 questions, Gail Patel. On top of list the questions you have, can you go back to your slide 6? Yeah. So I know you made an observation. It'd be interesting to get your feedback on AS set, because in AS set, typically the ASs are not sorted. That means it's very hard to find the origin AS.
No, but AS set says if you find an AS set, we don't even have an originator.
Exactly.
I mean, I personally don't think that's a good idea, because I think the aggregator could be the originator. But in the document, it says you don't have an originator. Once you don't have an originator,
You can't.
you can't. So it is not found at this point if there is no row that matches the prefix.
So it'd be good
But
to
if there's a row that matches the prefix, then it should be invalid.
Well, if you have a bunch of ASs in a set, you can't authoritatively tell if it was originated by the same guy.
No, but then the prefix is invalid.
Exactly.
Yes,
Or not found.
or not found.
All right. So maybe you got to, at least my suggestion is you document something and say, here are the rules. And then I have a follow-up question on your last slide.
Yeah.
We are
this
already
is the
deprecated.
summary, or?
Actually, in summary, you said that if the RFC 8097 is enabled, you see multiple states.
Yes.
Ideally, you should see same state across within an AS, right?
No, the point is this. What if I go one step back?
Unless the
Let
cache is out of sync.
me go here. So slide number 11. So if I have R1, R2, and R3, they can have different states if they point at different times. So now I have a prefix, and this prefix, let's say, for example, I see a row slash.
I got it.
Okay.
Hello, Alexander Azimov, Curiosity Labs. Thank you for the report. My question is, it made me anxious that if we are losing connection with the cache, the state of our received routes may be changed from valid to unknown. And with this wonderful extended community, these routes will be reannounced. All routes will be reannounced. Inside the net.
All routes that change the validation state, yes.
Yeah. Do we need to update this RFC about extended communities and remove sharing information about the valid state? Because it's quite enough to share information about invalid and unknown. But in the moment,
No, the point is
we are changing the state, and we are getting.
So if you drop invalid, then you never will send out the invalid. That's number
sure.
one. And if you now just take the unknown out or the valid out, then you still have invalid unknown. So I don't think you win anything.
No, it's different because the number of valid routes will be increasing. And finally, we are hoping that it will be nearly 100% of valid routes. The number of invalid routes is not that high. It will not be that high.
And I would prefer, instead of changing the RFC and making it more complicated, if you have more than one cache you're connected to, and if one goes, then the impact would be less. Maybe that would be a better solution.
You're suggesting to have a requirement to have at least 2 RPK caches connected to each router. Do you think it's reasonable or sensible?
I don't think it's very expensive, no.
I'm not sure it will happen in real networks, unfortunately.
I don't know. I mean, the thing is this, in our day and age, so if you take, I don't want to endorse any product, but if you take, for example, the RIPE NCC validator, and you just power up 3 virtual machines on different physical machines, and you connect to all of them, you have it.
Anyway, so from my perspective, that the situation when we are losing a connection to a cache and we are getting a reannounced of all prefixes that have a valid state, looks a bit strange.
To be also going one step further, the best thing would be you don't even use this RFC 8097 and you make local validation even on IBGP, because the thing is this: the validation is not expensive. Validation is not expensive. So if I also if the problem is this: if I have a system where I have distributed caches, this alone gives me already an interesting thing that I can have different validation states. How do I deal with that? What do I want to do about that? So if I say I validate within my router every particular update, I mean, there are many ways to roam. I don't think by saying, oh, we just don't signal one state will solve the problem. It maybe reduces this by factor X, but
have you took a look at the implementation of BIRD routing daemon and the way they implemented RPK cache? So it's just a piece of software with no separate cache, just inside, as far as I know. There is at the moment, there is no way to connect into another one.
No, but if the cache is part of the router itself, so if you lose connection to this, then the only thing how it could be that the whole thing crashed. So I mean, then you have a different problem.
You still have a connection with your trusted anchors.
I mean, the thing is this: the only thing what we want to do is here, think about it. Think about the implication. Think what is the best for your organization. You always can have policies, what you want to send out, what you don't want to send out. I think the more important thing here is that everybody is aware that there are some things that can happen. You might be able to see something in your routing. And I just want to bring you a pointer to say, hey, maybe it might be that. It might be even something completely different. So the more we look into this, the more we test, the more interesting things we see, the more questions come up. Sometimes we do something wrong. Sometimes we say, hey, wait a moment, that is just an attribute of RPKI, and it's fine as long as I know about it, as long as I can do something. I could think about if it flickers too much that I just turn off my validation cache, or I turn off the RFC 8097. So I only send you if I make a change in my selection process, until I have a stable connection. So there's so many different ways, and I don't want to tell you what you have to do, and I don't think we should stand here and say what you have to do. The important thing is that you know there is something, and you have to make your own decision what you want to do with this information.
Okay. Oops. We are done?
Go quick, you got 1 minute.
Oh, okay. So the AS set, as far as I remember, was considered when we actually designed the whole thing as something that should go away.
Yep.
And I'm not completely sure whether we were completely wrong about it, and it's not that design decision is now biting us. On the other hand, if one really wants to look into it, one should recognize AS sets essentially happen because some AS is creating an aggregate root. And that essentially means that, well, okay, you probably are going to see the origin of the aggregate root as the last AS before the AS set. Kind of, yes, things can be more screwed up, but kind of, if we are talking about 0.01% of the roots that we are seeing, and 1% of those roots are the special cases, well, okay. Huh?
I mean, if you want to open this box, that is actually something that I always like to open, because all the identifiers to identify an AS set, they're all optional. I can make AS path aggregation. If I don't put an AS set in my path, if I don't set the aggregator, you don't know it's aggregated, and all of a sudden my AS is the originator. So why is it not the originator if I put the AS set in? I put the AS set in because I cannot guarantee that I create a route loop. So we can open this discussion. I'm really,
okay,
since years want to have that, but
yeah. Well, okay. My highest priority comment actually is to your question: should we do a document? And yes, that might be nice. Maybe more documents than one. But actually, for getting started, I think we really ought to identify some repository where we just dump the stuff that we find and what we get along, and that maybe later on be refined into a document that actually has consensus and, well, okay, high quality and whatever. As far as I can tell so far, we really have not yet installed or recognized such a repository that we agree to actually use. I may be wrong. I may have forgotten about it.
the only one I know of is the email list and all the
well,
slides
okay,
on
an
the
email list.
thing. But I mean, that's a good idea as well. I mean, the question is just, is there interest in, if it is a document, if it is a GitHub thing, if it is, I don't know what other people who come fresh into the whole field can read and educate and get some ideas. If not, hey, be my guest. I'm fine with that as well. It is just an idea I throw in the room.
Yeah, well, okay. I think actually such a recognized repository is actually very, very much needed, because pointing people to a mailing list
is a little hideous, yeah, but works as well.
Joe Snyders, NTT. Two short remarks. In terms of AS set, the implementation done on OpenBHBD is that we ignore the AS set when doing the origin validation procedure. So we just look at the last sequence of the AS path. The implementations I've done on internet exchanges for route servers using BERT. BERT has an option to look at the last not aggregated ASN in the AS path. So we can just shortcut this discussion. AS set does not exist.
I mean, that maybe would be a nice update to RFC 6811 to basically the indication of an AS set will be just shut. But I think that's a different discussion. I think that the thing is this. If the only thing what we identified is that not every implementation either seems to validate ASZ. There are some implementations that actually allow you to configure the heck out of your router, and you can do whatever you want with that. You can even roll a dice. So I think if the vendor provides enough enough configuration so that you as user can decide what you want to do, that's fine. I mean, it's a little bit of a problem if everybody deals with this differently. It is just something where I say, maybe you should look into what does your router do with that and just know about how it works. And
Final comments. When speaking to operators about deploying origin validation, a question that often arises is, what will be the performance impact? And then I sketch out, well, it's Patricia cheese. We do the lookup in this table. The table only has this specific types of tuples, so we can do it in microseconds. Having a document where the title is performance impact of origin validation, or something more that just focuses on that one question, what is the impact, and that we can prove that there's virtually no impact, would be very helpful in promoting origin validation. So if you end up writing documents, one document specifying that there is no performance impact would be very useful.
Yeah.
If the document says use something produced after 2014, sure. Thank you.
okay, so okay, let me just. So we propose a validation state unverified, and I propose that for two things: for RPKI origin validation, as well as for BGP-SEC path validation. I believe it is important to distinguish between validated and non-validated routes. Just label non-validated routes as not found. Waters down completely the validation state of not found. We have, so there are situations where, for example, if I go on BGP-SEC for a second, if I receive routes, I might want to do lazy evaluation. So I just want to take them in. I want to do my route selection or whatever, and then maybe I want to do the validation later on. It would be interesting to see there if this route was validated or not just assign some label. And the same, I think, is also true with origin validation. The algorithms in RFC 6811 and 8205 specify values that are the result of a well-defined algorithm. Not validating something, if I just assign blindly a validation state, I water down them all. As programmer, for me personally, if I write something and I have pointers, I initialize them. I either set them to null or I have them to some objects where I know what they are. Just leaving them hanging in the blue doesn't help me. And sometimes I need to know if they are null. And I think the same thing we have here as well. For me, basically, an unverified and a verified route are not the same. An unverified and a not found is not the same. If this is the same, then what can I say if I see a valid route in my router? Was it validated? Was it not validated? There are some routers, as I said before, that on IBGP label everything as valid. So normally valid tells me that there's ROR that gave me the result that this route is valid. Now I just labeled it. We found 2 world usages. I learned in the meantime there are also a couple of more, but one, for example, Juniper has the unverified. And I don't want to, I'm not saying that I want to prefer this vendor to any other. I just say they, for example, have that. I like that very much. Our implementation has an undefined, what had a little bit more semantic, but I'm very fine with unverified as well. Going to RFC 6811. So we want to have unverified specifies the state of a route prefix which no evaluation has been performed. And to update the statement, if validation is not performed on a route, the implementation should initialize the validation state of such route to not found to the sentence if no evaluation of a route prefix is performed in any form, the implementation must initialize the validation state of such route to unverified. If I would have that, then I could figure out if, for example, the routers that returned on the AS set and not found, if they chose to not validate it, or if they have a bug. Because if they chose to not validate it, they should be unverified. If they validate it, I know there should be no invalid if I have a covering row. To this also RFC 8097 should have the unverified lookup in there as well. I don't believe that the absence of the community string tells me that my peer validated the prefix or didn't. Maybe it just does not send me the extended community string. And the whole thing becomes really important when you start writing policies for not found. Once you start writing policies for every validation state, you might be very interested in the fact if this one was validated or not. Because then you might say, hey, if I receive something via IBGP that was not validated, maybe I start my local validation, or maybe I low pref it, or maybe whatever. It could be a good thing if you look into your logs and you see, okay, why is this unverified? Why did the validation not start for that particular thing? Maybe I have a bug in my configuration. Same with RFC 8205. There we only have the state valid and not valid. And these one are the outcomes of the validation algorithm. If I don't validate it, then sure, it's not valid. But the not valid in this case means more, okay, it didn't pass validation. So if I did not validate it, if I didn't even attempt it to evaluate it, then I should say it's unverified. So in there, we would just say BGP routes, BGP-SEC routes must be initialized using the BGP-SEC validation state unverified until proper evaluation of the BGP-SEC route has been performed. How you evaluate is different. It's completely up to you. But if you don't do anything to the route, it should be unverified. Why should I set it to not valid? Why should I set it to valid? I think that's the last slide. Okay.
Rob Ostine. I don't strongly object to this, but I think this is a little confused. Both the origin validation and BGP-SEC went round and round and round on how many output states are there from the validation. Okay, and origin validation has the 3 states because they're very simple. It's good and I can prove it. It's bad and I can prove it. And everything else. What flavor of everything else is outside the scope of the validation algorithm? Now, I can understand an operational reason why you might care what flavor of not able to prove anything it is. But that's what you're talking about, is different
no, the
flavors
point is you made something very important. You said the outcome of the validation algorithm. If I don't even start the validation algorithm, then I need to initialize it. Because otherwise, I only have 3 states I can attach to this particular prefix. RFC 6811 says, if you choose to not validate something, you should, uppercase should, set it to not found.
Sure, but look at all the different, wait a minute. Look at all the different reasons why you could have failed to run the validation algorithm. You didn't want to, you weren't able to connect to something, you're having a bad day, and you're running really slowly. There are a whole bunch of different states there. The point was just to skip over all of that in terms of the specification. As I said, in your implementation, if you want to keep track of a whole bunch of different, we didn't quite get their states, whatever, it's harmless. But the algorithm description was trying to distinguish just the security state. And from the security standpoint, either you can prove it or you can't. Similarly with BGP-SEC, it's...
But if you say you can't, then why don't you say invalid? Why did you say not found? That's my point. You go and you take a perfectly valid validation state.
No,
that is perfectly well defined.
You skipped over something. Invalid is it's wrong and I can prove it.
Yes, and not found is I didn't find any raw information
No,
in the
not-
data set
not-
what I had.
Not,
Yes,
not found is mislabeled. Not found is everything else. That's really all it's ever been.
but if you look into
Similarly-
the algorithm basically says you look up, and if you do not find a covering route prefix,
Mhm. That's one reason why you might not be able to do
it
anything
doesn't
with
say anything about anything else. It just says this, and then it is not found.
No,
If
it's-
if I don't even look into it, how should I know that it's not found? How should I know that?
I did not find a security state when I was looking it up. That's all it is. Similarly with BGPsec, I can prove that it's good, and there's everything else. That's the algorithm description.
Rüdiger Volk, Deutsche Telekom. I think the BGPsec argument is somewhat different than the origin validation thing. In BGPsec, kind of, yeah, well, actually, no, I disagree with with the first statement. No, actually marking that you have analyzed the state of stuff, or you have not, really is significant information. The not found, as it is labeled in origin validation, by naive persons like myself, is interpreted like we know that with our current set of ROAs, it is not covered. Yes. And so we cannot tell within the RPKI whether it is valid or invalid, because the authorization scheme of RPKI doesn't say anything about it. Having not done and started the test really is a different thing, and it makes a lot of sense to have different policy decisions based on that. And with the BGPsec, yes, kind of we have done the checks and we found it is invalid. It kind of is a different thing than in origin validation, where the unknown really is a distinct state from invalid. But anyway, undecided. In logic, you sometimes run into the strange situation that the tertium non datur does not apply. Yes or no, true or fails, in some cases really has to be amended by we do not know, we may not be able to decide state.
And at the end, it's all up to the operator or to the user. You can say, for me, found and undefined, I treat them both the same. It's not that we say you have to treat them different. You can treat them the same. But you also could say, you know what, I want to hold back on them. Maybe I low pref them. Or I don't know, whatever you, like Rüdiger said, it might be of interest. And I think it is of interest to determine if a route was validated or not. And just assigning a not found, I think it's not the right thing.
And not distinguishing there quite certainly creates what was your term in the previous talk? conflicting state. If you have announcements coming in from a router that has, for whatever reason, lost the capability of classifying, and another one that actually does the classification, you are getting a conflict. Knowing that the one has lost its mind and cannot really tell, allows you to say, well, okay, if I have a better classification, I can use that.
Thank you very much. I suppose, are you proposing to write a document that discusses this problem? No, I mean, you're proposing to either write 2 biz documents or write something we can chat about on list at the next meeting or whatever about should there be another state? Or you're just bringing up a problem and saying, this is interesting and we should fix this, but not how.
I added this one actually to drafts.
Microphone.
Sorry. Oh, sorry.
There are actually 2 drafts uploaded.
Yep. Okay, great. Thank you. I think, Tim, this is you. I hope this is the right one. It says something different in the schedule says key roll. Anyway, that's probably my fault. And I was stuck trying to find the key roll draft, which I couldn't find.
Yeah, no, okay. But it is key roll. It just started live as a,
Okay.
but I'll get there. I talked about this a few times already. We currently have no proper way of rolling root keys in the RPKI. So goals of this whole exercise are that, well, we want to be able to do this in a reliable way. We want to learn from DNSSEC what can be learned there. But we also want to look at what we have in the RPKI and make sure that this has a soft landing into the existing standards, and we may be able to leverage things that we have here. Another goal that I think we can reach as well is that we can leave a trail for clients for relying party software that is out of date, that has an old trust anchor configured with it, that it may be able to find a new trust anchor. So the changes in the 02 version. There was not a lot of discussion at the mic last time I presented this, but I had a long discussion with Rob Austin afterwards. And actually Rob came on as a co-author as well. We discussed, well, extensively, and basically the bottom line of it is that we want to allow multiple keys in parallel. In theory, you can have 20, but the same thing is probably to only use 2 at the same time. It supports both planned and unplanned roles. You don't really know if you're going to need an unplanned role, so there is at the moment no indication of when you plan to do a role, because that might be misleading. You might say, I'm going to roll to this next key, and then it turns out you lost the next key. So we can discuss whether that's actually useful to include, because, you know, this should not happen all the time. But for the moment, it's not in there. Then the next steps, well, okay, don't take it literally, but I would say we're going forward with this. What we want to do, we want to actually make some running code, and anybody interested in that, I would say let's talk and work together somehow. An option might be to do that at an IETF hackathon or get together, but you know, there's other ways as well. So if you're interested in doing work in this space, then please let me know. This is actually the executive summary, let's say, to remind us all what we do it for, you know, ACAT. But if there is time, I do have more slides on how the process actually works. So is there time to go through that? Then I might do that. So,
About 10 minutes.
okay. Now, the current situation. We have trust anchor locators. The that are either shipped with a relying party software or configured. The software will then fetch a certificate, verify it, and then that certificate has a publication point where you typically find a manifest, CRL, and other stuff like a certificate for a child. Then that has its own repository and so on. So that's where we are today. And if you want to reconfigure the trust anchor, you have to put a new tile into your relying party software. So to avoid confusion between signed tel and tel, that was actually in the previous document. The tel is a plain text file with a bunch of URIs and a subject public key info fingerprint. But this object that we are now creating is a bit more than that. So I sneakily renamed it to trust anchor keys instead of tel to avoid that confusion. But I still have to get used to that name myself, so I might say sign tel by accident every now and then. So, but in any case, what you can do, just using one key like today, one root key, you can opt in to having this. You can create an object, a TA.tag object that basically refers back to your one and only current key and says, yeah, this is the current key. So validation software will be configured with the trust anchor. It will find the tag file there and discover, okay, the trust anchor I use is still current. So I'm good to go. And there is nothing else to look at, importantly. But of course, just doing this won't get you very far or not give you many benefits. So if you have two keys, well, what you can do is lots of drawings here. In this state, both keys are current. Both are fine. If you configure with a trust anchor for the first key, what you do is you find the blue TA tag file object, you validate it, and it refers to two trust anchor certificates that are current. So you will then need to look at both. Well, one you already looked at, but you'll need to look at the green one. You'll discover there a new tag file that also lists these two keys as current. So you're done. There's nothing else to look at. As documented now, the relying party tool can then just continue validation with the key that they started with. So they can just take is there a pointer here? Well, the top CA CER certificate. Oh, right. This one to continue here, right? And I left out the manifest and CRL here, for because it would get very cluttered, but of course in there as well. So another approach might be that you would say you have to take the union of everything that's good and do something with that. But I figured that this is the easiest. Seems the easiest to me. Now, to continue, if you roll to a new key, and this is a planned roll, what you can do is you can, well, first of all, you introduce a new key, 3. It has the same content as 2. But for number 1, you actually stop publishing child certificates and all that. You only publish a manifest in the CRL and a new long-lived tag file that says, I am actually revoked. And these are currently the new keys. Yeah, I guess in theory that could also be pointed to TA3 there from this point to here. But yeah, it's not strictly necessary actually. This file, this one still refers back. This one needs to be revoked. Letter out here because essentially the relying party only discovers this when they already learned that this is going to be revoked. And if you would keep the list of all the old keys around all the time, then this list grows and grows. So I don't think it's necessary. And that's it, really. Unplanned, though, I didn't make a slide of that, but unplanned essentially is you have no ability to update this. So it will stay like this, right? So the viewpoint from TA1 will be, okay, 1 and 2 are current. But then 2 will say 1 is actually revoked. So you still learn about it. And this is also what I meant with there's no timing indication in there. You could include it. And if you know, if you do a planned roll, that might be useful. But in theory, there's no way to be sure that that you may have to do an unplanned roll. So that's why I left it out. I don't think it's strictly necessary to have it there. But if other people feel it's important, we could include it. And I think that's it. Yeah. So I have an even more concerned cat here. And I would say, speak up.
Wes Herdeker, ISI. I've looked a lot lately into rolling top-level keys of various things, and well, the short and sweet, the TLDR is it sucks. It's not easy to do right. A couple of takeaways from what, and there's a document I need to actually publish at some point that after looking at all of, not just DNSSEC, but looking at X509 and PKIX and the web and that kind of stuff too, there's a lot of takeaways that I've gotten out of it that I can transcribe into a couple of bullets of wisdom. One, you need to plan on doing longer key rolls lifetimes than you were probably originally thinking, and I'll come back to that in a second. And 2, you really ought to be prepared with, multiple keys in the future. And part of it becomes from that need for a long key roll. And the reality is that in all of these systems, there are really 3 ways that keys get distributed toward, running systems. First off, you have software updates where keys are basically, encoded, whether it's a flash ROM in a router, or whether it's actually Bird being installed somewhere. They often come with pre-distributed keys, and that update process, especially in critical infrastructure, takes a very long time. So the other option is doing something like 5011 and DNSSEC, where there's this automated update mechanism. Not everybody turns that kind of thing on, so you can't assume that is always going to be the case. And as Warren found, things running in Docker don't really sort of have that longevity of measurement. And then 3 is the manual configuration, where users wait until the very last second before they finally update their config. You can't really worry about them too much. But my takeaway from all of this is that it takes a lot longer to do those key rolls, and therefore, especially if you're planning on accommodating the software pushes, the pre-packaged software pushes, that's on the order of 2 to 3 years. So it might actually be beneficial to have 2 to 3 keys staging in advance, not just 1 or 2, and being prepared for that. And so the good news is, you
can have this state for a long time,
and that doesn't work in DNSSEC.
Forgot to say that, but the document also says something about that you may actually wish to start shipping this, and if this is your intended new key, what you might want to do is update all the underlying party software vendors out there to get them to include a new one instead. Right. But you probably shouldn't do this, every week.
And I like the fact
unless
that
everybody supports it, fully automated, etc. But I think we're a long way from that.
I like the fact that you're considering using double signatures, which we couldn't do in DNSSEC due to packet size constraints and things like that, which you don't really suffer from. So that's the positive side. But at some point, you still have to turn off the old key,
yes,
and you're still going to break everybody that failed to
yes.
update.
Hi, Job Snyders. Just relaying a message from IRC. Peter van Dijk from Power DNS would like to sit down with you to share the good lessons and the bad lessons from DNSSEC. And sync up to see if some mistakes made in DNSSEC can be avoided in this rolling mechanism. So that's a standing offer.
Rüdiger Volk. I'd like to point out that the RPKI use actually has some significant difference from DNSSEC. in RPKI, we actually need to expect that relying party implementation has some heuristics that raise alarms if things start to fail in big ways or, well, okay, in suspicious ways. I'm not sure that all of the existing relying party implementations do this, but one cannot repeat that often enough until it is this way. And of course, they also need some heuristics how to deal with it. And that needs to be documented in some ways. So now for DNSSEC, one would expect that, yes, operators of resolvers get some feedback, but kind of the expectation in RPKI deployment, I think, is that relying parties really need to have those alarms and the workarounds. And yes, that's not really helping with this design.
That's basically this point, right? So you have a relying party software that doesn't support any of this. It's configured with this trust anchor locator, and it comes here and it finds an object that doesn't understand and an otherwise empty repository.
Yeah.
And yeah, I don't know if all the validators alert about that. I think the Right Institute Validator 2 series at some point raised alerts if there was a change larger than 10% of the repository or something. But yeah, that may need some.
That's really important.
Wes Herdeker, ISI again, because I forgot my second bullet point, which is that the other thing that was horribly broken with the DNSSEC key rule in particular, and is also broken in the X509 world, but nobody's thought about it as much there, is that the signaling mechanism, so the publisher of a key can trust that all of the relying parties are actually using the new key, is basically non-existent or broken or incomplete. And so ICANN had, an absolutely horrible heartburn up until, a month ago, where they finally just had to go, we're going to do it anyway, without knowing if things were going to break. And you guys might have the opportunity to kind of fix that, but knowing how files and sync are synced, I'd have to go. I'm 2 years out of having read the specifications, so they're not in my mind at the moment.
So you need to do revalidation top down all the time anyway. So I see Ross is in line, but you suggested a document to me where basically inside a certificate you can signal this is going to be the next key. I looked at that, but I figured that we actually have a way here to do this as well within the RPKI because of how it's published. You need to validate this whole repository anyway, so you can have an object there, a signed object that basically says these things that we want to communicate. And that's essentially why I went for that. But I think in terms of semantics, it's not that different. But so two takeaways. It's essentially saying these keys are next. Public key fingerprint essentially, and a location where you might find them. And it's communicated within, let's say, in band of the RPKI repository, so you can find these things. So I think you're doing validation all the time anyway.
I think you're missing my point, which is that maybe that I'm actually talking about the relying party signaling to the people that it's pulling data from, looking at the routing object, saying these are the keys I trust, so that the publisher of the objects can say, oh, it's now safe to switch to using a new or revoking an old key, because all of the relying parties have now, gotten to like 99% of accepting the new key. And without that signaling measurement, you just burn heartburn the entire time.
Right. Well, yeah. Okay. Just shooting from the hip, what you may be able to do is monitor the access to these things are published in different places. Right, so you can look at your access logs and figure out if people still try to fetch the old certificate, for example.
Keep in mind for
But-
the questions that the mic.
But no, yeah,
Over time,
okay, it
so-
needs it needs some more thought because yeah, you're right, it's incomplete.
So this is Russ. I think there's a big difference between what Wes was just talking about and this, because our certificates have an expiration date. If we get to that point, it doesn't matter. That is not the case in the environment Wes was just talking about. The other thing is, I do think the document I pointed you to creates a situation where people get used to building the next at ahead of time, and so you're always in a situation where, in an emergency, you have the keying material. Let's go.
Randy Bush, IJ Anarchist. Unlike the lovely world of DNSSEC, a failure to validate within the RPKI tree is a soft failure. It will only produce not founds in validation. Relax.
So, Warren Kamari, the other thing we learned from the DNSSEC key role is that, or something, or maybe the only thing we learned, is that emergency key roles are really, really, really different to regular key roles. And actually the process that we have for normal key roles in the DNSSEC don't work at all for for emergency roles. And I think that there's some correlation here where, my key is no longer trustable, needs a better signaling mechanism maybe.
Okay. Yeah, just coming back to what Wes said. Actually, currently the document says these keys are equivalent, and we have no way of telling you which is going to be the next one. So you can't really monitor what people do, right? Maybe it's better to change it to really say this is the intended next key, regardless of that. Maybe you do need to do an unplanned thing, because then you can monitor whether people have moved over.
Thank you, Alex. You're up.
Good afternoon. My name is Alexander Asimov from Goethe Labs. And today I'm going to provide a short overview about all works that are related to root leaks. So as far as I know, there are 3 active drafts in different working groups. First one is the BGP Open Policy, and it is related to preventing networks from leaking. The second one is the oldest one, and now it's about detection of leaked prefixes using communities. And the last one is using new RPKI object and is capable to detect both mistake and malicious activity. So looking at this comparison, one may ask, why do we need this thing with communities? Because we already have something more powerful, more advanced, that is capable also to detect both malicious and mistakes. And the problem is time, and time does matter. Taking a look at the ROA deployment process, it will take years before we'll get ASPA verification in the wild. And that's why we decided to use communities to detect root leaks. We will not be able to detect malicious activity, but still it will be helpful to detect accidental leaks and so protects our networks from these kind of threats. So this is how I see the strategic plan. So at first, the first will be delivered community-based leak detection. And I hope it will be delivered during this year, or not until at the end of this year, but during 1 year period. I hope it will take less than this. The second will be leak prevention. That will also automate the way leak detection is working. And the last one will be ASPA, which together with ROA records will finally bring us to the paradise. But so, there was an update of ASP draft, and authors worked really hard. As a result, we have a new abstract and some small restructure of the document. But there was an important clarification in the version 01. ASP is not trying to provide a full IcePath check. Instead of its predecessors, it just provides a tool to detect real operational problems, hijacks and root leaks. That's all. It's not a general solution for the IcePath. It's just a solution for real problems. So this is how I see it in the near future. I hope you will be able to see this progress in a half year. So BGP open policy seems to be nearly ready to the last call. We already have 2 implementations, and so after a cleanup, I hope there will be a last call and it will be successful. Second, root leak detection is also nearly ready. So after yesterday growth session, it seems that we finally decided to go on with large communities and specifying format for these large communities. There should be no locus anymore. And ASPA verification, it seems that we are ready for adoption call. So I request adoption call now. Thank you. Any questions?
Please be sure to send your request to the list.
Sure.
Otherwise, I'll forget.
Rudy Volk. Stupid question. Well, okay, you are saying for open policy, there is still cleanup necessary?
Cleanup in the text. Just there was some ad hocs that were included. It's some time ago, and we just need to make a cleanup to make some clear statements.
Because time matters. Can that be done really quickly now?
I hope so. I need some inputs from my co-authors. I hope I will have it during this meeting, and after that, we are done.
Okay. And as you are asking for adoption, yes, the ASPA is fine.
Yeah, thank you. So it's good that we have a consensus. I hope so. And I hope that both working groups of all working groups that are related to this topic, GROW, IGI, and Sidrops, will soon see the progress in all these drafts. So thank you.
Sriram. That's totally not your slide. I have no idea whose slides those are.
It's just improvised. Roll and it's gotta be good.
It's got 2 rolls in it, maybe 3. It's hard to tell. Hold on. Who knows? It's around here somewhere. Come on. Download the interviews. It's coming. No. It's not that. It's this. Yep. Good gracious.
Thank you. We discussed this back in London, desert policy, and here the idea is to drop invalids if it is covered. If there is another prefix route in the router that is for the less specific that is either valid or not found. In that case, the more specific invalid can be dropped. So this is a joint work between NIST folks and JOB. So just to recapitulate what DISR policy is, basically DISR stands for drop invalid if still routable. So the idea, as I said, is drop invalid if a valid or not found less specific route exists. And why do we want to do DISR policy? So if a ROA for a subsuming less specific prefix exists, but there is no ROA for the prefix that you announce, then the DISR policy working elsewhere in other ASs, it ensures that the traffic for the more specific still reaches you. You are the correct legitimate destination for it, and but it reaches you possibly in a suboptimal or non-traffic engineered path. Invalid announcements of your more specific by you or others are rejected. So that's the basic idea of the DISR policy. So we updated the draft to, we got pretty good feedback and discussion when we presented it in London, including comments on the list. So there are 2 or 3 main discussion points, questions that came up that we have addressed and updated the draft in the O2 version. These are included. So the AS0 ROA question came from Tim, and the wording in the draft, which did not exist before, it says the existence of an AS0 ROA for a prefix means that the prefix or any more specific prefix subsumed in it are forbidden from routing, except when there exists a different ROA with a normal ASN for the prefix or the more specific. So given that understanding of AS0 ROA, the DISR policy must apply the following exception. If a route is invalid due to an AS0 ROA, then always drop the route. So hopefully that takes care of Tim's question. So normally you would, if a route is invalid, you would look for a less specific that is either valid or not found. But if an AS0 ROA is the one that makes it invalid, then don't even look for it, just drop it. We can take questions on the fly if you like. Okay, let's a couple of more minutes and we can finish through this and go to the questions. And KU raised this other question about default routes, 0.0, V4 or V6 in the routing table. So those must be excluded from consideration in the DISR policy. That's what I think KU wanted to see. So that wording is also in the new version of the draft. John Scudder pointed something about multi-homing. So Jeff has had some multi-homing question. So John took a cue from that and he posed this other question. So in this scenario, there are 2 /24s at the bottom. Those are aggregated by AS2 into a /23. And that /23 gets to AS4 and via another path through AS3, the /24 on the right also goes to AS4. And there may be also a hijack also happening from AS5. So John's point was that in the case of multi-homing, the /24 on the right, it is really multi-homed so that it can have reachability in the event of a link failure. So in this example, the link between the /24 on the right and the AS2 fails. And now the question is, for some reason, John thought that AS2 might still be aggregating and forwarding a /23 to AS4. And John's concern was that AS4 now it drops all the invalids and routes the traffic for the /24 on the right to AS2, and AS2 has no way to deliver it. So that was his concern. Then he's saying that sort of the purpose of multi-homing is lost. But the point is, this is happening when you have a combination of things. There is multi-homing, no ROAs are being created by this /24, and there's also a link failure. So apart from the combination of all those things having to happen, if you look at AS2, one might ask if the link is down and it is no longer has announcement for the /24 on the right, why is it still aggregating? It should just deaggregate and send only one /24 up. So that itself probably answers John's question. In addition, of course, any multi-home customer in any scenario should be always clueful about RPKI. If they don't create ROAS for any of the multiple announcements they make to their upstreams, and not having ROAS, not a good thing. So in terms of conceptual implementation, Jeff this was not in the original draft. Jeff, before the London meeting, I spoke with Jeff Haas, and he offered some interesting insights into what is feasible in implementation. So that aspect is now captured in the updated draft. So the next two slides, which talk about conceptual implementation, they are now included in the draft. They are fully described. They are described at the level of conceptual implementation. So Jeff's idea was that you don't do the deserve policy as part of the path selection decision process. You do the path selection decision process, including origin validation, and then you put your valid, invalid, not found routes in the local RIB. And after that, you do the deserve policy. And before you'd send the routes into the FAB or the ADG ribbons from the local RIB, that is where in between those two is where you do the deserve policy. And that seem to make perfect sense for many people that looked at this in London when we presented it. So this included in the new draft. And another point is that you can have these three situations that arise: a valid or not found route that was used to drop invalids. A new one can be added, or an existing valid, not invalid route may be withdrawn, or you may have a route, RPKI state changes and the router is informed about it. In all of these three situations, we need to do something. That is, a policy needs to refresh, and those are described as well. So, thank you. Questions? And yeah, okay, sure. We would also like to request an adoption call on this draft. Okay.
Job Snyders, NTT. This may come as a bit of a weird statement given that my name is on this draft, but I am not so sure at this point whether pursuing this draft is worthwhile, because I feel we've been somewhat overtaken by events. If I look at origin validation deployment, and I've had some hands-on experience by now, the mode of operation simply is reject invalid and deal with the fallout. The DISR mechanism, we came up with that as a sort of dampening mechanism to ease into origin validation, given that there's between 5,000 and 6,000 invalid PGP announcements in the default free zone. But I think attacking the 5,000-6,000 invalid announcements should perhaps not be done through a router change where we, upgrade code, look at a deployment timeline of 3 to 4 years, and then have a degree of tolerance for misconfigurations. I think it will be easier for everybody if we just reach out to the people that have misconfigured their ROAS and ask them to fix it or delete it. Nusanu has shared some research on the RIPE routing working group mailing list and on the NANOC mailing list about who the entities are that have done misconfigurations. And it seems that the majority of misconfigurations comes from only a handful of companies. So I think this is I've come to realize that this may be a disproportionately big hammer for a problem that can be attacked through different means. And conceptually, I like this, but I'm really not looking forward to getting to running code, because that will require me far more work than just biting the bullet and dropping invalids and calling it a day. So I'm not sure I'm not sure if we should pursue this idea.
So for the IXPs, it seems like it makes sense to drop the invalids even now, because like you explained yesterday or in the IEPG, it will just go through the transit provider rather than go through the IXP, right?
So what I didn't
But
highlight-
in other cases, that may not be true. There will so if you drop invalid, there will be so the assumption that there won't be any invalids after some time if you are diligent and make calls. I don't know if that assumption would hold good in the long run.
So what I didn't mention at IEPG, I did mention that IXPs should drop invalids right now, but in the Dutch networker community, we are deploying origin validation in ISPs, where we do the same philosophy and drop invalid announcements. And there's a significant number of commercial internet providers that are dropping invalids, and they report that it's not harming their business and that it's a viable model. So
you are able to drop invalids without affecting reachability for this situation?
So it affects reachability, but it doesn't affect business. Another number I can share from
It doesn't create user tickets.
Well, it creates a few per week, but it's manageable. That's the message. The discovery of the networker community is, hey, we can drop invalids and it's not hurting us too bad.
Can I quickly interject? Since you both are the co-authors in the document, I'd suggest at least to take this offline, and then once you have a consensus amongst yourself, make a request again if you want to still adopt this as a working group document. Thank you.
I guess, sure. So Warren Kamari, I'm also part of the NUC team. So on this network, we have two peers, eBGP peers. We're taking full routes from both, and we're dropping invalids on both. So it's 6,100 prefixes or so, or routes that we're dropping. Nobody's noticed, nobody's complained.
No ticket.
No tickets. I mean, he noticed and was like, why are you still passing these on? And then I realized because the filter wasn't actually applied. But it seems to just work. Presumably, some of them are following covering routes. Maybe.
Yeah, about 4,000.
Rüdiger Volk. I guess the timing argument is fairly important, but first thing is I hate it when someone explains that AS0 ROAs are anything special. The only special in the AS0 ROAs is that we know that routes with origin AS0 cannot occur. Hopefully, the router vendors actually enforce that, or the ISPs in their routing policy.
No, there is no route with AS0 ROA. There is only a ROA with AS0. No route.
Yeah. Well, okay, but explaining anything special about AS0 ROAs is kind of misleading people. If I create a ROA for an AS that I own and I know will not show up in the wild, it is effectively the same as an AS0 ROA. Yes, well, okay, kind of creating special semantics for it are something that I would question very seriously. But Keyor, actually, if you found that also one has to protect against using the default routes, of course, that is something where you figure out, well, okay, you do not only want to protect against 0::/0, you also want to protect against 0::/1. And where does that end? And consider that as an invitation to people to announce /8s again that they do not own in the public v4 and all that stuff.
I just wanted to comment quick, Tim Ruijsels, quickly on the AS0 thing. So personally, I'm not a fan of AS0 ROAS, but I brought it up because people perceive these things as meaning block this. And if that is intended, then you would need to do something extra for that to work. That was my point. It's not that I actually like them or want them or anything. I think that's a completely separate discussion.
But people who think that there is actually special semantics don't get the clue that when they do their AS123 ROA, it essentially excludes everything below, regardless of what AS number, and unless like in the AS0 case, a more specific ROA is issued for a different AS.
Okay, I think probably any more needs to go to the list. George is up. Okay, he's gonna be
Thank
dead
you.
on time. Thank you. Oh, there's George. Hi, George. Hey.
So hopefully this is a shorter version of what we've all seen once before. So the problem statement is reasonably straightforward. We have to have a coordinated state between three slightly different communities of actors. We need code to both sign and validate, and we need an agreement to move to using that code by both relying parties and signers. And we have to decide how we're going to move. This, of course, is predicated on the assumption we want to move in any class of technology in this space which is materially going to alter the behavior of validation or demands change in the existing software suite to take respect of something like an OID change or a structural change in the certificates. So these conditions are, in some senses, a general statement that would apply when we make non-compatible changes to this system, but they are specifically focused in this conversation on validation reconsidered. So I did a review of what I felt were the code changes. We had conversation last time. There are some people who would disagree with my summation of the ease of doing this. I left the slide in for sheer cheek and outrage, but essentially there's a conversation about how hard it's going to be. We have not had a real conversation about a timeline. As RIR, as the engineers in the RIR community, we feel a very strong concern inside our own space about our exposure to risk here. And we would wish to propose a future date, which has not been defined in this document, because that is presumptuous, but we think that we need to define a future date to have a flag day and give somewhere around a year of notice to complete a migration to a new OID and a new model of validation. And our intent is to actually go into the NOG community and talk with operators to get some sense of convergence and consensus from that community of what they want to do. But when I presented this idea last time, I got very strong pushback on an expectation that a draft should exist that is a formalism that can be talked to in that context. And having discussed this in the ECG, we agreed to submit a draft. So there is now a draft document which was lodged midway through last month, which I am effectively seeking adoption on. And it discusses some technology questions around what do we actually want to do here? Do we want to make a complete radical shift in one hit to a new OID space, or do we want to have some mixed mode of operation where the introduction of a new OID provides signaling options of a rigid validation model and a more lax validation model, and the questions that would arise from having provision of both in the same information space? I feel very strongly, personally, that it is simply not possible to move without some sense of tripartite convergence on this. It's a mutual deadlock situation, and that does implicitly mean anybody in that sense of community who says, I will not move, has oppositional qualities that really are a roadblock. We can't move without code. We can't move without consent and agreement by relying parties and CAs to adopt this new technology. We can't deploy TALs specifically in our RIR role without a sense the community is ready for them, because deployment of something with a radical new OID instantly breaks the validation model for everybody. I still believe that we are in that golden moment. My sense of the number of active parties who are engaged in this is that it is less than 500. Now, we can quibble about what the exact numbers are. I am involved in a body of work with a collection of people to try and explore this space and understand how big is the field of people who are using this system. So we already have a problem. It's a distributed problem, but it's not internet scale in the sense of tens or hundreds or millions of people. It's 500 engaged entities. And it feels to me like a flag day is logistically simple and actually can be done. We can do this. So I'm seeking working group adoption for a zero state draft that has been authored by myself and Tim. Tim was in the RIR system and wrote the initial state of this draft in his previous state, but he has since moved to a different role. He now works in NLNet Labs developing RPKI software, Routinator 3000. Sounds like something that should be on sale on a TV shopping channel. Yeah, it's brilliant. I mean, I think it's brilliant. Yeah, these apps, the Routinator did this for me. So he's moved role, and we'll probably consider an author shift, because it's not fair he should have to take the eggs and tomatoes, because he's not actually in the RIR space, but nonetheless he remains on this ground state draft, and we'll discuss what to do next. But this is assuming we get adoption, and clearly there are many things in the conversation. One of them is that we probably have some flaws in the model. We might have put forward timing constraints or behavior constraints that are wrong. So there are conversations of merit around how does it work. But there is also the more important conversation for me, which is what would be a to be defined date. If we were going to do this, what are we prepared to put in the ground as a stake and say we're aiming to move in 2019, in 2020? Because to me, that's the more important quality. What we do when we move, I understand in technological sense is more relevant, but the decision to move and when and how much notice in a process sense is what actually motivates and drives me, because that drives the conversation in a community to an emergent consensus. That's it. Rudiger.
Hi, George. My memory is leaking, so I may have, well, okay, my ears are sometimes dumb. So I may have missed something. Do we actually have a roadmap where also interoperability reports show up? Having running code, kind of yes, kind of having the kinks actually worked out, probably would be good to have been achieved and proven before the flag day comes.
That's probably a fair point. If we were going to actually do this and make an assessment of dependency and interdependence, then having an understanding of which platforms do implement support for this, would or could implement support, have some interop, that's reasonable. I believe the RIPE validator has code for this model. I'm not convinced that it's live, but I believe it was at one point implemented in their code base. But there's a reluctance to undertake a body of work that doesn't have broad consensus. We're left with a problem, and we are very aware of our exposure of risk in this problem, and this is a path out for our problem, but we have the other side of the balance book. We have budgets in time and in labor. So if there's no community intent to move, then asking people as validation software developers or CA signing party to implement is a burden they don't need. We need the signal. But no, it's a fair point. We would need a matrix. We would have to understand interoperability. I can stand here for another 15 minutes if you really want 20 minutes of me, but I don't think you want 20 minutes of me.
Can I make a suggestion about the time that you're asking for? The date? I think it helps to just make a date. Say 18 months from when the RFC is published.
Okay.
Yeah. Otherwise,
we put 2019 in the original doc, but
Excellent.
it feels a little unrealistic. I don't know.
Jeff Houston, Rudiger's point's really quite valid. If there's no code, like setting a date's bullshit.
Yeah.
You know, stop.
No, it's fair.
Right, you need code. You need to actually have working interoperable code before you can figure out when a date's valid. That's all I'm saying.
So we probably have to
Carts
dig
and horses.
So we
please,
probably
gentlemen
do have to
and
dig the
ladies.
hole in the ground and write the code and test it to see if it's viable to move.
That would make an awful lot of sense in an operations area, George. Yeah.
The long-haired friend behind you has comment at the mic.
Well, Rob Ostine. So it should not be news that my gut reaction is 2 days after hell freezes over. However, I completely agree with Rudiger's comment. If you want us to consider this seriously, I would be more comfortable with deciding whether or not to do it after we know whether or not it works. So write the code first, test it. If you can prove that it's harmless, we can have the conversation about whether it's a good idea.
Okay, this is actually very good input because we have a coordination meeting this week and we can actually discuss investing the time to do the code base to provide a basis to make the move. But Rob, you are an author of validation code and you have a time budget for work in this space and it's pretty small. So are you saying you will implement?
I don't recall having said that.
Fair enough. Okay, I'm good. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Do I actually have to formally stand on one leg and say requesting adoption? I mean,
As with everyone else who's done this today, please send something to the list, or else I will forget. I may still
standing on
forget,
one
but at
leg
least
is
you've
quite
documented it.
tricky.
That's it. See you in the next place we have to meet. Yeah, it's we're right under a thing too.
Yeah, exactly.
This is good.
Yeah, but I toned down my aggressive stance on it because when you said be out of a.
I talked to Robert Wick. I think he said. What's that? Yeah, they also kind of. Yeah, and I don't need to go
I wanted to get my bag. All right. I need to get my bag. Because modern times allow you to print from phones. Yeah, so I could have printed documents and everything.
All right.
Yeah. For me, that's
Yeah.
Can you tell me what I'm showing this?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Any champagne in your bag?